Up another friend of Kretsu, Linda, Mack. Again, as you go out to these different family office activities, you quickly hone in on some folks that have been around for a while. And they have these really cool closed door sessions where we're not allowed in. And so like, oh, who's running that? And more often than not, it's been Linda. So she's been a great friend of Kretsu, again, very encouraging of us, that she sees potential in what we're trying to do here, and so we've been talking about getting her up to Seattle here. So Linda has got just a terrific, breadth, depth, background, been involved in so many different organizations, seen lots of different things, and really she's going to talk about staffing. And as we talk about building companies, again, it's team, team, team. And when we look at building your family office, again, it's your internal team, your external team, and so I think it's, again, after you get your plan in place and your internal family team together, then you got to look at the external team and bring those resources to bear to make sure you create a successful organization. So, Linda, we got you mic'd up and everything ready to go there?
I think so. Is it working? You guys hear it?
Turn it on.
No.
It's off. There we go. All right, we got it switched on here. So please join me in a warm welcome here for Linda Mack.
Thank you, and thrilled to be here with you. The one thing it didn't say in my bio is that I grew up in a third-generation family business. On my father's side of the family, second-generation family business, entrepreneurial on my mother's side of the family. My brother has his own business, I have my own business, and my mother said, none of us can work for anyone else but ourselves. So I share your entrepreneurial spirit. Thank you for having me here today, and yes, here we go. So what we're going to look at today is kind of how does the family make the decision, once they made the decision they want a family office, how do you go about starting to build it? And how do you staff it? And what are some of the key things that you need to be thinking about to do that successfully? Because it's like building a house. You don't want to get started building it and then have to take it apart and start all over again. So being thoughtful up front in terms of what you're trying to build and what the purpose of it is and so forth, really important. And to talk a little bit about some of the trends we're seeing in the market, and then talk more specifically about recruiting, retaining, and compensating your family office team. How do you build it, but how do you retain them and compensate them as well? Some of the challenges and some of the best practices around that. And I'm sure Chris is going to make the slides available, so you don't need to worry about writing things down. So starting with the family office decision, one of the big things that when we're particularly working with first generation wealth creator is that, you know, a family office is a dynamic thing. It's not static. You don't build it. You don't build everything in one day, and you don't build it and then not look at it again. It's going to evolve over time as the family's needs evolve, as the circumstances change and so forth. So you want to be directionally cognizant of where you're going long term, but understand that you need to keep revisiting it, and that it is going to grow and it's going to evolve over time. Key things to think about, and Kip mentioned some of these things. You know, again, I use the analogy of building a house. You got to know what it is you're building. If you're building a house for you and your family for the next 20 years, then you got to think about what is that going to look like, the budget, the time, the cost, the whole thing. Same thing with a family office. Before going out and starting to hire anybody or putting anything together, the biggest thing is to stop and think about what is the mission? Who are you building this office for? What's the mission? What's the vision? What is your long-term strategic plan? And then quickly, I'd say there are three key things that need to be thought about. You know, who are the clients this family's going to serve, short-term and longer-term? Easier question than it seems. You know, is it going to be just the bloodline family members? Is it going to include spouses? Is it going to include stepchildren? I mean, you think out beyond just the G1. What's the scope of services to be provided? You know, again, obviously the traditional services are finance, accounting, tax, investments, estate planning, and so forth. But what about education? What about a big philosophical one is concierge services? Are you going to provide those or not? You know, a lot of families grapple with these things, but they're important things to think about. And then what's going to be insourced versus outsourced? That can make a big difference in terms of what kind of office you're going to be building and what kind of staff you're going to need. Story I like to tell on that, and this is true, of two families, the two principals co-founded a multi-billion-dollar company. They had a partial liquidity event, and this was in a regional city. It was not a major financial center. Anyway, multi-billion-dollar business. The two principals had a partial liquidity event. They each started a family office. 15 years later, one has 9 people, one has over 90. The difference is scope of clients to be served, family clients to be served, scope of services to be offered, and what's being insourced or outsourced. In the case of 9, their philosophy was they were going to serve bloodline family members only. They're providing accounting, finance, tax, estate planning, administrative kinds of services. The family members are going to do their own. If they have financial planning needs or banking needs or investment needs or whatnot, they're going to do that themselves. In the case of the 90 plus, they're doing it all. They're serving, and the family sizes are about the same, but they're serving the family members, they're serving spouses, they're serving children, they have over 20 people in-house in their investment staff, lots of private equity, lots of direct investing. They've got a team of a dozen at least on the just finance and accounting side of things, doing everything from financial planning to bill pay and so forth. Then they've got a separate tax team, fiduciary team, philanthropic entities, and so on. So you can get up to 90 plus quickly. But again, the whole point is, to really be thoughtful about what are you creating, what are you building for the long term, who's it going to serve, what's the scope of services that you're going to offer. And again, this can evolve. Better to start small and evolve than to try to overbuild and have to remantle. So important things. Once you've got some of those decisions made, now you're ready to start to build the office. There's a slide in here about insourcing, outsourcing. A lot of people always say what drives those decisions, and I would say for families it's largely going to be around competency. What kind of competency is going to be required to provide a service in-house? What's the cost of it going to be to do it in-house versus externally, and sharing those resources and the economies of scale. Control is huge. People often say the 3 biggest reasons a family builds an office is control, control, control. So that's a big one. Confidentiality, very, very important. Customization, if you've got your own dedicated staff, you can customize anything you want. There's a price tag associated with it, but you can do it. And then the last is conflicts of interest, which is big. I mean, a lot of families want to avoid conflicts, and one sure way to do it is make sure people are on your payroll and beholden to you, and they don't have any other masters that they're serving. So those are some of the reasons why people do keep things in-house, or some of the considerations for outsourcing it, particularly on the cost and the competency and bench strength. So let's look at a couple of overall trends and then talk about some of the challenges and best practices. I would say overall in the market, and I founded Mack International in 2002, but was working with families for the prior 20 years, the competitiveness of the family office market and the talent has grown considerably. I mean, it is truly become a highly, much more sophisticated, intensely competitive market. So accessing talent and retaining talent is a lot more difficult than it ever used to be. And the access to information is much more than it used to be. Families, you couldn't find them, you couldn't find anyone in them, now you can find a lot more about it, and the family office people residing in the offices talk to each other. They compare notes. So there's a lot more information flowing between them. Specifically, we're seeing, again, a lot more professional and sophisticated arrangements across the board. Increased use of employment agreements in a couple of surveys, family office specific surveys that were done. Over 40% of family office executives are under employment agreements. That number approaches close to 100% when you get to CIOs and CEOs. So it's again, they're tracking the institutional markets more and more. Better definition of performance management and compensation plans, and I would add here before the hire, kind of the trust me, join me, and we'll figure it out is not a real good way to be able to land the talent that you need to really build what you're trying to build. So being very thoughtful about that, and that we're definitely seeing candidates aren't going to accept an offer unless they feel that you've really thought it through, and those things are very defined. Prevalence of bonuses and annual incentives. The number from the surveys of, and this is well over 250 families reporting in. Over 75% are paying annual bonuses, although the majority of them are still discretionary bonuses rather than formula, but certainly a lot more better definition of performance expectations required for bonus. What we are seeing is a really consistently and steadily increasing use of long-term incentives. Over 50% of the offices that report in are using long-term incentives. The three top ones are co-invest in deals. The second one is deferred supplemental long-term compensation. That's probably the simplest one. And the third one is carried interest, obviously, particularly in families that are in private equity. In many cases, we're also seeing the loans used to provide leverage. Most of those on a recourse basis, but they may be forgiven over time. The interesting thing is, of the families using long-term incentives, over 80% of those families are using more than one type of vehicle. So they may be using one long-term incentive vehicle for performance-related incentive. They may be using another for retention or retirement purposes. So it's been interesting to watch there. Retirement planning is another thing we're seeing a lot more if you want to retain the person for the long term, and most of our families want someone for 20 years. People are being more cognizant of what do you do for them. This is where, too, some of these long-term incentives come in play. More formalized governance. Again, if you're going to attract and retain someone, having sound governance processes, decision-making processes, and so forth need to be there. And just more formalized recruitment and retention strategies overall needed to attract and retain people. You know, again, you're not going to land a successful person from someplace and have them come and join you unless they think you've really defined things and they can see a long-term path for themselves as well. So let's talk more specifically about recruiting, and then we'll go into compensation. What are some of the things kind of unique to family offices, and what are some of the best practices to be able to be successful long-term? Say, things unique from our perspective about families is they generally want to hire someone who's going to be there for the next 15, 20 years. That's not the case or the expectation necessarily in large corporate or institutional kinds of platforms. But it is with families, like your doctor, your lawyer. You want someone who's going to be there. They don't like disruption. They don't like changing leadership talent. So that's a challenge. Culture fit, at the end of the day, culture fit is paramount for success. We always say that finding someone with the requisite skills and experience to do the job is the first cut. 95% of everything we do is culture fit. And that gets into, somebody mentioned before, you know, you've seen one family. The values, the philosophies, the communication style, the leadership style, the relational kind of style. Are you an employee? Are you a partner? What are you? The relationship between the families and the leaders. A whole host of dimensions that go into culture fit, and if you don't get it right, it just is not going to work out. So that's very important. Candidate supply. Again, when you figure the dimensions here, you're looking for somebody who's going to be there for the long term, and you're going to have a culture fit on top of the skills and qualifications. Those are hard people to find, particularly since we generally say that the ideal candidate coming into the family office to lead it is what we call the expert generalist, meaning they need to have knowledge across the whole horizontal continuum of wealth management. So finance, accounting, tax, investments, estate planning, philanthropy. Depending on the family, it may involve family education and other things. They also need the peripheral vision to know that when something happens over here, what are the three things over there they've got to watch. And then they'll have depth in whichever vertical they need, depending on what the family's trying to accomplish and what the staffing looks like, or what their insourcing, outsourcing model looks like. Those are hard people to find. You know, in this day and age, you find a lot more people who are specialists coming up silos than you do people who know, well, wait a minute, if I'm investing in here, how am I going to optimize with the tax side of things, and how am I going to make sure that the estate plan and the investments don't conflict with each other? So again, candidate supply, big challenge. Two biggest in our experience working with families well over 20 years, the two top reasons continue for why family office hires don't work out. Top two reasons. Number one, a family, and this is particularly in setting up an office, families often hire someone who they like and trust. an advisor, someone out of the operating business and whatnot, and the person winds up not being able to do the job that needs to be done. That can be a very tricky personal situation too. The second one, which happens quite a bit, is a family will go out and hire a rock star who may have run somebody else's family office, and they come over and they're just not the right culture fit at all. So both of those things can be prevented if you spend the time up front to really define. We started off with the fundamentals for success, defining what the office is meant to accomplish. When you get into the roles here, defining the roles very, very specifically, and then define the culture fit requirements. We use a 360 assessment process before we start any search, before we even build the profile for the candidate. That looks at where the family's been, where they are, where they're going. We, again, if you take a 20-year, 15-year time frame, what it is you're trying to accomplish back into a profile, the kind of position that translates to, and then talk about the culture fit requirements. So you can be successful on a sustainable basis if you do those things, and whether you do them or you hire a professional to help you do it, it's important that those steps be taken. The other two reasons why things don't work out are lack of an effective search and selection process, or once you've got them, and this happens way too often, lack of effective onboarding or retention strategies to keep the people. So I always tell the story, you buy this beautiful flowering plant at the market on Saturday, the guy tells you, here's how you need to provide it with food, water, and light in order to be successful, or for it to bloom. You go put it in your house, you go away on a trip for a week, come back, the plant's dead. You go back and tell the guy at the market, you sold me a defective plant. And the guy says, well, I'd surely be happy to replace it if it's defective, but can I first ask you, did you give it food? Did you give it water? Did you give it light like I told you to? Well, no, but I had to go on a trip. And the guy says, well, I appreciate that, but by the same token, the plant wasn't defective. If you'd given it the food, water, and light that I suggested, it would have bloomed. So important to keep in mind that once you've hired them, like any relationship, it takes a lot to keep it blooming. So what are some of the other challenges unique to investment executives being hired? We get calls all day, every day, people saying, I want to go to a family office on the investment team. And we say, why? Well, long-term patient capital. I'm tired of having to raise funds, blah, blah, blah. And I often say, and how patient are you? 20 years, 30 years? Tell me about patience. So I think the two sides of a coin with families, in many cases, they are investing for the long term with patient capital. But unless there's a consistent flow of new capital into the equation, unless there's a recapitalization or a realization, liquidity is going to be a challenge in terms of hiring and retaining your talent. Many families have gone into liquidity puts to provide some liquidity options at, say, year 5, 7, 9. Again, that goes only so long. At some point, you've invested your allocation. And so this is a continuing challenge for families in terms of how to attract and retain their investment teams. The last one there is really just a business risk of being in the business. If you've got a team and there is no upside continuing and they decide to leave and start their own fund, I mean, that's, you can only do so much, but that's always going to be some of the challenges when you're hiring investment teams in-house. Best practices, learn from years of experience in terms of how to attract and retain the talent. Again, as we talked before you even begin a search process, really spend the time to think about what is the office trying to accomplish, what's the strategy, what's the business plan, what's the mandate, what are the position specifications, what are the performance expectations, what are metrics for success, and what are those culture fit requirements, the personal characteristics and attributes. And then you're ready to start to implement or execute the recruiting selection assessment process. And truly, if you really do it well, it is strategic. How are you going to identify? You've defined what it is you're looking for. You got the bullseye painted. Now, how are you going to go out and find them? What's the strategy to identify where you're going to go in the market? How are you going to target them? Targeting them is only the start. How are you going to get them to engage in a conversation with you? And then how are you going to reel them in like the fish and assess whether they're the right fit and ultimately get them on board? Once you've got them across the finish line, how are you going to onboard them? And we call it build a plan for success. They've got to own it, but you do as well. What does that plan look like that's going to enable them to be successful? and that's a two-party relationship, the family and the executive. Authority and resources to achieve goals. Nothing more frustrating, and we all know it, we're all entrepreneurs, nothing more frustrating than hiring a high-performing person and they don't have the resources to accomplish the goal that they need, or they don't have the authority commensurate with the accountability to accomplish the goals. So that's real important. And these are all, by the way, the reasons why people listen to us when we call them about a new opportunity. The converse of any or all of these things is why they listen to another opportunity or seek one. Professional and personal growth opportunities. Family offices are small. You know, they're generally flat. There may be limitations in terms of upside opportunity, but you can be creative. These are onesie kinds of jobs. You can be creative in terms of providing opportunities. Board positions, variety of areas you can be creative here. Sound governance, competitive compensation and rewards goes without saying. It's got to be competitive. We'll talk more about comp in a minute. Sound governance, again, people are interviewing you as well when you're out hunting for the right talent. And if they feel that there is not a good governance process in place for decision making and so forth, they're not going to take the risk of joining you. You know, it's hard for them to get back in the market as well if it doesn't work out. So they're also looking for a long-term fit. Smooth family leadership transitions and succession. This one is not so much about the startup, but for the successor CEO coming in as an example. We've seen some real horror stories where families, to be nice, didn't really come up with a good transition plan to have the existing CEO move out. And with all good intentions and trying to be nice, they don't let go and the CEO doesn't let go and it gets very messy. I'm sure you've had some of these in your portfolio companies. So there has got to be a plan up front in place that has timeframes and responsibilities and accountabilities, and it's got to stay on track. Get your board online with you to support you on this and anyone else who needs to be, but it's really important that it happens. Otherwise, the new executive is going to get frustrated and you're going to risk losing them or things getting very messy. Turning to compensation for a few minutes here. You know, first just quickly, what are the drivers? I think goes without saying, but in family office, some of these are a little bit more challenging than in the normal corporate markets. First of all, family office size and complexity, definitely AUM. Complexity, scope, and so forth are a driver. They're highly correlated with compensation. The position itself in terms of the level of position, the scope of the position, the complexity, and the decision-making authority are factors. Family philosophy is huge. Family philosophy around compensation is a huge factor in recruiting and retaining talent. Quick example, some families believe in co-invest to the point where you are required to co-invest your bonus. And on top of that, they're going to give you a loan and really get you up to, with recourse, get you up to your eyeballs in it. Another family will say, we absolutely do not believe in co-invest. We think that's a total misalignment of responsibility, and that's going to encourage you to want me to sell when it's good for you, not when it's good for me. So philosophy around things like incentive comp, philosophy around family versus non-family compensation, around carried interest is another big one. It's one end of the spectrum to the other, but you need to really be thoughtful about it because it has a huge bearing on where you're going to go in the market and what your recruiting strategy and ultimately your compensation strategy and retention strategy are going to be. Competitive market and geography, there can be some premiums there depending on where you are, and obviously performance of the individual in the role is important. So what are some of the challenges unique to families? Defining your competitive market as a family office is really challenging. You know, who do you hire from and who do you lose talent to? It really takes being thoughtful. It's not as readily, information is not readily available like it is in the public markets or in the broader markets. So you've got to be thoughtful there. Comparable job information. One of the biggest titles are meaningless in the family office market. There is no title police. You can call someone anything you want. You can call them chairman, you could call them, we've got entrepreneurs particularly that came out of the investment business. They will never give somebody the title of CIO no matter what. They'll call them a portfolio manager, maybe a VP investments. Other people will call somebody a CIO and they're not really they're overseeing outside people who are investing the funds, but they're not really performing a CIO role. We have people send us, say, what do you think about my CFO? And I said, well, you know, this isn't really a CFO, it's a controller. Oh yeah, but we want him to feel good. And I said, well, that's fine until they go to a conference, talk to somebody else, come home and tell you that you're underpaying them by $100,000. So, you know, so title consistency, really important to get apples and apples and based on content if you're going to start to benchmark and try to look at what compensation is. Design, and then again, obtaining reliable compensation data. I've been involved with a couple of surveys here, very involved, happy to send you copies of those if you'd like. But the point is, we are, and I've been involved with them, we don't do them for fees. We're just doing them to contribute intellectual capital to the market to help to build more informed decisions on the part of families. But again, a lot of caution around looking at titles and looking at ranges. If you don't know the content, you really got to get underneath that and get to apples and apples. Challenges, a couple of other challenges is typically you don't see in a family office a CEO and a COO and a CFO and a CIO. Lots of blending here. So again, behind the title, you could have, and this is out of the surveys, only 48% of the CEO presidents reporting were just that, meaning their job is blended with one of the other three on here. 72% of CIOs are CIO only, and then you see the rest of the figures there, 62%. So the point is, again, the apples and apples comparison here, that's really important. On the CIO, I like this, is that, again, inconsistency of title. What you're seeing here is a range of CIOs. Somebody always says, how much do I pay my CIO? We say, well, it could be anything from $300,000 to $3 million plus. And they go, really? Again, content is really, really important here. You see on the one end of the spectrum, a CIO who the family may be using an outside consultant, outside investment people, and the person inside is really just overseeing but not doing any direct investing, to the point, the other end of the extreme where they're doing everything in-house and the CIO is making all the decisions. So again, just pointing out that title and content can be very challenging in the family office world. Best practices, this is kind of the last slide here, but again, just kind of a list of best practices when it comes to compensation. Defining the roles, really important. Again, content is everything. If you're going to try to benchmark, you need to know what you're benchmarking. And family versus non-family members in family offices, very important to look at that. Determining your compensation philosophy and strategy. We talked about that before, but it's really important to be thoughtful about it. And to the extent that there's a difference between family and non-family on philosophy, like some families will give equity to family members, but not to professional hires. You know, again, very important to be thoughtful there. Performance management processes, important that you have those in place. Expectations, metrics for performance, that's going to be important for compensation. Defining the structures very carefully. They've got to be aligned with family values. They got to drive. Incentives do work, so make sure you're driving the behavior that is going to accomplish your objectives. Testing, really important. Very fast story on testing. During 2008, make sure that you know how these plans are going to behave in like a 2008 scenario. So 2 CIOs I knew, 2008. One was under a plan that their performance was benchmarked against a customized benchmark. They were down 18% for the year. The benchmark was down 24. Their plus 600 basis points triggered a huge bonus. Family not very happy. They were down 18%. In fact, it stuck in their craw so much that they wound up switching, hiring a new CIO within the next year. They just, from the CIO standpoint, they did their job. They beat their benchmark and they saved them a lot of money. From the family's objective, losing 18% was not what they planned on. Other CIO was on a plan that was LIBOR plus 500 before they got anything. They managed to very aggressive, neither of these portfolios could sell anything. Very aggressive risk management. He was down 2% for the year. Pretty heroic. I think most people would claim with a $1 billion plus portfolio during 2008. Yet his plan was LIBOR plus 500 or nothing. And the principal there said, I don't make money, you don't make money. So again, you got to be really thoughtful. Some of the lessons learned there are, I would say, you always want to have a discretionary component. You may want to think seriously about 3-year rolling averages versus 1-year plans. So you take out these wild 3 sigma events. and a few other things there. But documenting plans, very important, and then whatever it is, you've got to have an ongoing, consistent process.
Excellent. Please, round of applause here for Linda. And I just got one question to wrap us up here. We've seen a phenomenon where angel investors, are kind of an interesting group from an employment point of view. They're entrepreneurial. They've got a lot of skills. They look at deals. They do due diligence. Usually there's nobody paying them to do any of that type of work. But, there seems to be a lot of demand within the family office community. And recently we've seen a phenomenon where as our family offices are co-investing with our angels, then they build a relationship with the angels, and then the angels end up going to work for the family offices in either full-time or part-time or advisory capacity. Are you seeing a trend along those lines? And for the angel investors that are here today and tomorrow, it might be a way for them to add on some additional compensation, horsepower, access to capital, which angel investing, you're generally losing money or giving all your time, usually aren't getting compensated much for it. So this would seem like a way people can be more full-time angels, also support some family office activities. Can you just talk about that as the perspective on today?
I think families are getting more and more comfortable with it. I think as they gain more experience, I think the first thrust, what we've seen that evolution here is that family offices typically will bring an investment team into the office itself. And that's the first iteration. They have gone, kind of off beta. They've just figured they can't beat the public market, so they're going to outsource that, and then they're going to focus on more direct investing. They like that anyway, particularly the entrepreneurs. The second phase of the office generally is that they move the investment team out of the office into a separate entity, and then they start to focus on beyond. First of all, it's more direct private equity investing, co-investing, because at this point they can set up a website, call themselves something that bears no relationship to the family at all for confidentiality purposes, but they can be out there more or less advertising to other families that they welcome co-investments and they're looking for deal flow. I think the third iteration, but this becomes really families who are sophisticated enough to really understand what kind of talent they need if they're going to do this well. Because you don't just do one or two angel investments. You've got to really be thoughtful about building a platform to be successful, or you need to find a partner to do this with until you learn more. The families who get in trouble are the families who don't, it's the building the house analogy. They don't bring in the talent, set up the infrastructure, or have the resources required. And when things start going south, they either get skittish, they have all their resources tied up in a workout or something.
Because the talent to do direct investing, you're either going to pull from maybe the VC ranks.
Right.
If you go to corporate, Wall Street type firms, again, those people don't have the entrepreneurial boots on the ground experience.
And that's the culture fit side that's so important, and that's why I do think that the angel investors and the people who are VC and early stage are, the appetite there is growing in the family offices. I think some of it depends on what their experience has been, but I think that definitely the appetite is growing, and I think that for them to meet people like you through Keiretsu, the worst is when they meet, somebody at a cocktail party and they get into something they have no business being in, and then they have a bad experience and they say, no, I don't want to do this again. What they really need, and I think the better enlightened and informed ones, are building relationships with people like Keiretsu. You heard Howard speaking earlier about his family office. And I think that's the way I would encourage any family office to do it. Find a good partner, find somebody who you can leverage with, and access good investment opportunities and good angel investors if you're going to bring talent in house.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Linda. Please, another round of applause for Linda Mack.